1902, Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Nestled deep in the heart of the White Mountains of New Hampshire sits a remnant and trophy of the glory days of northern New England tourism, and one of the last grand hotels remaining in the state of New Hampshire, the Mount Washington Hotel, now known as the Omni Mount Washington. However, through the centuries' worth of history and development that the hotel has seen throughout its storied halls, stories linger about those who never fully left the grounds. The Mount Washington Hotel has developed a thriving superstition that the hotel is haunted by supernatural entities, none of which is possibly more famous than the builder of the hotel, Joseph Stickney's wife, Carolyn Stickney, who is still said to reside and haunt her bedroom at the hotel. Now, is it possible that this historic landmark could be a hotspot and haven for ghost activity? Or is it possible that this is just a bunch of hogwash made up to sell rooms? Today on Unblurring the Unknown, we explore a historic place within the state of New Hampshire and explore some of the ghost stories and figures that have been stated to still reside within the creaky floorboards and foundations of this grand resort. Today, we explore the haunting of the Mount Washington Hotel. Welcome back to Unblurring the Unknown. As always, I am your host, Dominic, and if you are listening to this show, I first want to say thank you for doing so. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please turn on post notifications so you get notified every time I post a new episode. If you're listening to this on YouTube, please like, comment, subscribe. It helps me out within the algorithm, and I greatly appreciate it. Now, to start off the show, I felt like, we're getting into October now, about the middle of October, and I felt like it was only time for us to kind of dive into maybe some spookier stories, and it's been quite a while since I've done a ghost story, and like I said, today on the show, we're heading back into the realm of the paranormal, and it has been quite some time since we have done this, and like I said, I felt like it was only right to go back and explore a good old-fashioned ghost story. That's the heart of spooky season, the air getting colder, the leaves are falling. You cannot help but not think about ghost stories and hauntings of that nature, and I felt like there was no better story to share with all of you of a hotel that is practically in my backyard up here in New England, and that is of the Mount Washington Hotel. Now, this is a property, a location that I have been to many times. I know quite a few people who have worked there, and it is a pretty popular and famous place in its own right. However, the stories of the ghosts and hauntings there are widespread, and the stories themselves seem to take on a life of their own sometimes. And I want to share that all with you today. Now, how today's episode is going to go is that I'm first going to dive into some of the ghost stories that have been spread about the building and the property, and then lastly, at the end, we will discuss theories about whether or not the property is truly haunted, or maybe if these are all just stories that are pure fiction rather than fact. Now, before we dive into the ghost stories of the Mount Washington Hotel, I felt like it was only fitting to give you a little background, to give you a little history about this area and the hotel in general. Now, before the Mount Washington Hotel stood, you had many people starting to build these houses throughout the White Mountains of New Hampshire to act as vacation retreats for these wealthy tourists who were traveling north from Boston and New York. A lot of these houses were kind of like halfway points for these travelers who might be hitching multiple train rides to get up to Montreal or something like that. And this is when these inns and early hotels started to pop up. These were extremely beneficial as this area was devoid of places to stay during the mid to late 1800s. So a lot of people started converting their own homes or farmhouses to accommodate guests who were traveling north. Now, the first iteration of what would go to be known as the Mount Washington Hotel would actually be a separate hotel and would be constructed by a lumberman named John T.G. Levitt that he would construct near Mount Washington. Now, just a little knowledge nugget for you who for those of you who might be unfamiliar, Mount Washington is the tallest mountain in the northeastern United States and is known for some of the craziest weather phenomenon in the world. It actually holds the record for the coldest wind chill ever recorded, and the coldest temperature ever recorded at the peak of the mountain was negative 47 degrees. But back to our little history here. So John T.G. Levitt would construct the Mount Pleasant House in 1875, and this would be a very modest lodge-like structure that would only have 40 rooms, and this would primarily serve tourists traveling up to this area and through it via the Crawford Notch Railroad. Then in 1881, a railroad tycoon and coal broker named Joseph Stickney would purchase the Mount Pleasant House and roughly 10,000 acres of land near Mount Washington. Stickney, together with his business partners Oscar Pittman and John N. Coiningham, would undergo renovations to the property and add another level to the Mount Pleasant House, allowing it to accommodate more guests. Then in 1894, Stickney would become the sole owner of the property after buying out his business partners and start undergoing another series of rigorous renovations as well, and purchasing several other 100 acres of land for just $10,000, which would be roughly $376,700 in today's money, which, if you think about it, is still cheap considering what some people want for a measly 5 acres now. Stickney would go on to add a series of trails around the grounds of the hotel, allowing the guests staying there to be able to connect more with nature and be able to take in the natural beauty that the land had to offer. Fast forward to the year 1900, and while Stickney had done the extensive renovations to the Mount Pleasant House at this point, he had much higher ambitions. He wanted to construct a new grand hotel on much of this property that he would have purchased in the earlier years. Stickney would get in touch with architect Charles Allen Gifford, who was a prominent architect from New Jersey and was known for his work in designing these fancy, high-end resort hotels of this time. Stickney would break ground on this hotel project that he would end up calling the Mount Washington Hotel. And then in 1902, after 2 years of basically non-stop construction at the Mount Washington, it would finally and officially be open to the public. Now, at this time, it was a beacon and feat of engineering and architecture, and it was truly a one of one. However, the good news of the hotel opening would be overshadowed just a few months later. In early 1903, a few months after the Mount Washington hotels would open, Joseph Stickney would pass away. Now, he would end up leaving the whole hotel to his wife, Carolyn Stickney. Now, Carolyn would later remarry in 1908 to basically into French royalty, which would make her a princess. Now, that little factoid about Carolyn being Princess Stickney will come back into the story here in just a little bit. However, under Carolyn's leadership, the hotel would see an immense amount of success and growth. In 1915, golf course architect Donald Ross would construct the hotel's 18-hole golf course. Fast forward all the way to 1936, this would be when Carolyn Stickney would pass away after running the hotel for pretty much 30 years at this point. Since Carolyn did not have any children with her first husband, Joseph Stickney, or with Prince, and this is a very long French name and I'm going to butcher it, or with Prince Jean-Baptiste Marie de Fessigny-Lusigny, which that's his full name, and that is very much a mouthful. Now, because of Carolyn not having children with Joseph or Jean-Baptiste, there was no direct line of succession for the takeover of the business. So this would leave Carolyn deciding to leave the hotel in the hands of her nephew, Foster Reynolds. Now, perhaps the most notable historic event to take place at the hotel would be done in 1944, when the Bretton Woods Monetary Conference would take place between the United States and other global powerhouses and countries during this time. Now, of course, this was during World War II, so during this time, the United States needed someplace nice, but also off the grid in the event of an attempted attack on this conference, so that led them to using the Mount Washington as the host site. It was glamorous enough to welcome all of these world leaders at the time, but also be off the grid in New Hampshire, so that no other enemy country would even think to look there. During this conference, this is when the International Monetary Fund would be established and the global price of gold set at $35 per ounce, as well as the American dollar being used as the standard for global exchange rates. Maybe perhaps not the most interesting of events going on during that time period by any means. However, the Mount Washington Hotel played a role in the furthering of the global economy during that tumultuous time period. Now, from 1945 to 1975, the Mount Washington Hotel would go through a variety of different owners. Foster Reynolds would sell it to wealthy Boston-based business people, and then the Fleischer family from Philadelphia would purchase the property from them. Then in 1969, the Mount Washington Development Company, operators of the Bretton Woods ski area, would purchase the hotel from the Fleischer family and take over operations. From then on, the Mount Wash continued to be acquired by different companies and LLCs and underwent many, many renovations, expansions, and the combining of the facility's offerings within the Bretton Woods ski area, which was just down the road. Then in 2009, the Omni Hotels and Resorts Company would purchase the Mount Washington and rename it to the Omni Mount Washington and immediately start a renovation project into restoring and keeping intact the iconic red roof of the otherwise snow-white colored building. Now, while the Mount Washington has endured 123 years of existence and history, you are also here on the show to listen to the stories that have seemed to follow this building through time and be attached to it. Perhaps even the spirits that haven't seemed to let it go. Now, perhaps one of the most notable of the ghost stories would be the idea that the hotel is haunted by the ghost of Carolyn Stickney. Now, she does have numerous points throughout the hotel where she has been seen, most notable within the dining room area of the hotel and her bedroom, which is room 314, also referred to as the Princess Suite. And the room itself still has her bed inside of it that people can still stay in this room. Now, those guests who stay within room 314 have reported a variety of paranormal activity. One source I found stated that the writer of the article had stayed in the notorious room 314 and spoke to a member of the housekeeping department and stated that he had seen dresser drawers fly open on their own and the room's TVs turn on by themselves with no one around. People have started seeing the ghost of Carolyn sitting on the edge of her bed and items shifting and moving all around the room. Now, while Carolyn is the most cited and famous spirit that resides within the halls, I remember me personally having a strange experience at the Mount Washington Hotel when I went on a ghost tour with some of my high school classmates. Now, I remember on this tour that the tour guide explained to us that many people had died during the construction of the hotel, and that during this day and age when the hotel was being constructed, and that in the very early 1900s, the respect for people and the respect for people's lives was not valued like it was today. Now, of course, you think about it, if somebody died on a job site today, odds are that site would be shut down, an investigation would be launched. However, this was just not the case back then. If someone happened to die on the job site, they would just keep working. And this, of course, would be, in my opinion, quite a way to anger a spirit, if you ask me. Now, you not only have the ghost of Carolyn Stickney, but also perhaps the ghosts of people who died while the hotel was in construction, and even perhaps the ghosts of people who passed away in the hotel, as that has happened as well. There has been people who have passed away inside the hotel while the hotel was in operation. However, during this tour, the tour guide would show us a photo that had been taken during an all-staff photo, and if I'm remembering this all correctly, the photo was sometime in the early 2000s before the hotel was purchased by Omni. Now, the tour guide showed us this photo, which was a kind of, like I said, a photo of all the staff, and it was taken at an angle at the side of the hotel so they could fit every staff member of the hotel within the frame of the photo. And when you look at this picture, you can make out the silhouette of a woman standing in the window of one of the rooms in the hotel. And it was in the room that was exactly one floor down from room 314. And she, or whatever this figure is, was wearing a white dress. And this is a garment that Carolyn Stickney's spirit is sometimes had been seen in as well. Now, this photo, when I saw this photo in particular, it kind of sent a shiver down your spine. It kind of has the fact to do that. And the tour guide went on and said that, of course, all the staff were in the photo. There was nobody in that room at the time, so there is no way that this could have been somebody who just happened to, poke their head out the window or step in front of the window as the picture was taken. that's not possible. And she reiterated numerous times, and I cannot remember for the life of me this woman's name. It was many, many years ago. But she said that there was no way that somebody was first in that room, but also that it could have been somebody who had just happened to wander in. That there was no idea. They could not explain this photo. And this photo is very eerie, very ominous. And I will try to find this photo. I believe it's on the internet somewhere. I will try and find this, and I will post it on this week's post for the show on Instagram so you can all see it and so you can all kind of understand what I saw in the photo that she showed me. Like I said, I'm 99% sure it's on the internet. So I will find it, and I'll get it up on Instagram for you all when I post it this coming week. Instagram is Unblurring the Unknown, all one word. You can find it there, and I will try and post it all for you. Now, in addition to this, the tour guide had actually taken us to room 314 so that we could see the princess suite. And during this, the tour guide got kind of very excited, but also equally confused. As we went into the princess suite, she had noticed that the bed had an impression in it, like somebody had laid down. And it did. The bed did have an impression in it. And like I said, it looked like someone had laid down in the bed after it had been made, like the sheets were kind of matted and pressed down in spots, like somebody, like I said, had laid down or sat down in the bed. And like I said, the tour guide kind of got really excited about this, but also kind of very equally creeped out. Like she was saying that there was no way that anybody could have laid down in here, that housekeeping had just done the room and just had cleaned it after the previous guests had checked out, and that no one would have been able to be in here. And this was kind of very intriguing because there was, like I said, that impression left behind on the bed, and it was very spooky and things like that because she herself couldn't explain it. And of course, this is a ghost tour to a certain extent, and she's giving it to a bunch of high school kids who have kind of an equal fascination in this type of stuff. But she was very much like, okay, this is a little weird. Now, in addition to this, we did notice the entryway light flicker within the room as well. Now, while that was labeled as odd as well, you could say that that could be very easily explainable. Something wrong with the electrical, very old building, things like that. But that, in addition to the impression left behind on the bed, was just very odd. And it made the vibes in that room kind of even more strange than they already are. Now, while I personally had that experience, I found some more experiences that I want to share with you all as well. Now, I found this first batch of stories from a website in which the author of the article stated that they had talked to a former employee of the hotel and stated some experiences that they had sightings in, and I want to share that collection of sightings, and then some I was able to find on Reddit as well. And then lastly, some sightings and stories that I got from a former employer of the hotel that I personally spoke to. Now, with that being said, let's move into the first batch of stories for you all. Now, here's the first batch of stories that I have for you all that I first got off of this website. And like I said, the author of the article had spoke to a previous employee of the hotel, and this is the batch of stories that was on that website. And here is the first one for you all. And I quote, "On more than one occasion, I would be walking in the main lobby and would see out of the corner of my eye what seemed to be a lady looking out over the mezzanine. Each time I would glance up and the image was gone, but a lot of employees and guests have said to have that same experience. We all agree it was Princess Carolyn, who was married to Joseph Stickney." The second story, and I quote, "In 1997, I was working as a housekeeper and had to clean room 314, the princess's room. I went to service the room that newlyweds were staying in, and I knocked on the door and there was no answer. I opened the door, went in, and there was a little girl sleeping on the bed. Immediately, I went into the hallway to see my inspector and told her I couldn't clean the room because a little girl was sleeping. She said that was odd because the guests were newlyweds and nobody else was registered. She asked me to leave a note that I was coming back in an hour to service the room. I went back in the room to leave the note by the table. I walked in the room quietly to not wake the little girl up. When I looked at the bed, instead of a little girl there was a woman staring right at me with the most scary smile on her face. She had black hair and was wearing a white dress. I got chills down my spine and I just stood there frozen. She sat on the bed and kept staring at me. I ran out of the room and told my friend, who was also a housekeeper. We both went back into the room and there was no one there. I still have a hard time remembering that incident, and I get chills every time I speak about it. I have had many friends that have worked there, and I've heard a lot of scary things that happened. Oh, the day before this happened, my friend and I took pictures of ourselves on the princess's bed. Everyone tells me I made her upset by doing that. Another story, and I quote, I had a few experiences, but this one is one that stands out the most. A few summers ago, I was bartending in The Cave, which is a hotel bar. It was just after we opened, and I was standing on the side of the bar. No one was near the other end of the bar. The only people in the room were me, the other bartender, and the two guests that were standing and chatting with. All of a sudden, we heard a loud thud at the opposite end of the bar, and a stack of teacups and saucers we had stacked underneath the bar came flying out at least 4 feet and smashed all over the place. No doubt in my mind there was a spirit in the room. The guests we were chatting with quickly finished up the conversation and left for the night. They never came back for a drink. And the next story for you. In the late 80s, early 90s, when the hotel was still only seasonal, I was working alone in the ballroom late in the fall, just before shutdown. That time of year always seemed to have more ghost activity, like they knew we were all leaving soon. I had been working on the floor and was resetting the room for a large meeting. The ballroom had super heavy curtains on the windows at the time, and I had closed them all. I was moving chairs from the other side of the room, and at one point the curtains started flowing as if someone had a hold of them and was waving them back and forth. I checked all the doors and windows, and nothing was open. It made me wonder if someone was messing with me. I set down a chair and stood back up, and clear as day, I saw a woman standing there in a hoop-style dress. Without even thinking about it, I started to leave. But then halfway to the door, I went back to see if someone was playing a trick. I went back out into the middle of the ballroom and was facing towards the lobby of the hotel when it just felt like someone brushed past me. I guess it wasn't a trick. Now here was another couple stories that I managed to pull off of Reddit as well. And I quote, I know this is an old thread, but bumping it anyway. So we live in the Boston area and we love to go to Bretton Woods to ski. And when we do, we stay at the Mount Washington. First time I went was in the summer of 1978 with my parents. A few years ago, we were staying in room 319, just down the hall from Carolyn's room. At the time, I had never heard about the hauntings that night as we were getting ready for bed. The lamp next to my side of the bed flickered like crazy, then went out. I turned it off and back on, thinking it was the bulb. Nothing. So I called the front desk and told them, and they said, give it a few minutes and try again. It's just Carolyn playing. I was like, what? So then I started Googling it and found all the stories. About 5 minutes later, the light came back on, all on its own, and it wasn't an issue for the rest of the day. Also, when I got up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, there was a distinctly cold spot in the bathroom, even though we had the heat cranked in the room and our toothbrushes had been knocked to the floor. We've gone a few times this year and had one stay in 321, also down the same hall. And we had more light flickering in the walk-in closet, and while my wife was in the shower, one of the drawers on a dresser opened and closed on its own. Opened on its own, I didn't see it happen, but neither of us did it. We're going up again this weekend. If I see anything, I'll post again. And here's another story I was able to pull off of Reddit. We stayed there October 12th through the 14th, 2024. Monday, 10:14 at the pool, my wife asked what happened to my back. I said, what are you talking about? She said to give her my phone. I had claw marks all over my back. Took pictures, showed many of the staff. No answers. We slept in separate queen beds, my wife with my daughter. Never felt it. It didn't itch or burn. Saw doctor 3 days later. Faded remnants. Tuesday afternoon, day after we got back. On floor with young daughter. Heard a noise, turned around. A toy penguin of hers was spinning rapidly on its head. No explanation. Car in the area, but that's impossible. It's not a top. I tried it. Takes a few times to get it enough force to balance and spin. These are true, and I can't explain them, and no one else can either. Nothing has happened since. Now, with the person I actually had a chance to interview, in regards to a couple stories that they provided me, they are a friend of mine, and I am choosing to keep their identity anonymous for the reasons a lot of these people did as well with these stories. And however, I want to reiterate this, that I don't want to get in trouble, and I don't want to put this person in trouble for speaking upon a story that could have a negative impact. However, I'm just saying that I am merely interpreting these stories and retelling them. So I personally don't really care that much if somebody wants to come after me for telling a story, but this is genuinely a story that was told to me from them. And for that sake, again, I will keep their identity anonymous. They no longer work there. They're a former employee. But of course, I want to keep their name anonymous for just the sake of the argument and everything like that. Now, the first story they told me was one that kind of spooked me out, and I found it very strange. Now, this person was working within the presidential ballroom getting ready for an event with a coworker. They state that while they were working in the presidential ballroom, that a couple of kids had entered the ballroom and stated that their sister was in the bathroom and that a man was inside of the bathroom with her. Genuinely creeped out and concerned about what possibly could be going on here, and perhaps thinking the worst, they went to the presidential ballroom bathroom to investigate. Now, the bathroom itself, as they told me, contained numerous stalls, of course, but the bathroom itself was able to be locked from the door to enter from the inside via deadbolt. So there's a main door that it can be locked from the inside with a deadbolt, but there's, of course, stalls. It's not like a single bathroom or anything like that. Now, they had tried to open the door. They discovered that it was locked and that it was deadbolted shut from the inside. Now, while the worker and their coworker stood outside of the bathroom, they could make out a man's voice coming from inside of the bathroom. They would get in contact with security, and when security would arrive, they would be able to unlock the deadbolt and get inside of the bathroom. Now, when they did, there was no man inside of the bathroom, just the sister of the kids that had told the workers about the incident. Now, the witness, / my friend telling me this, stated that the little girl in the bathroom was young, roughly 3 years old, they guessed, and that it would have been physically impossible for the girl to even have been able to reach the deadbolt on the door to lock it from the inside. In addition to this, no evidence was found of the man's voice they heard coming from inside the bathroom with the young girl. Now, when they told me this story, I couldn't help but think perhaps that this was some type of, restless spirit that maybe perhaps could have died during the construction of this hotel, or maybe even the ballroom itself. However, that is just my own theory. Now, the second story they told me was more like a collection of events. They stated that on a certain occasion, they were working and setting up for an event and noticed a female coworker walk past them. Now, they stated that this was incredibly odd. As the coworker walked past, she had a very strange and perplexed look on her face and stared at them. They thought this was odd, so they went to talk with their friend who was in the other room about this weird encounter they just had with their female coworker, and their friend stated that this was weird, considering that the female coworker had been in that room and had not left, meaning that there was no way there could have been this female coworker that had walked past them. They would go on to state that this was pretty common for people to be seen and then magically vanish or appear somewhere else entirely. Now, I did struggle to find sightings and stories for this week's episode, and when I stated that I had a hard time finding testimonials about what people have seen at the hotel, this former employee stated that a majority of the employees that work at the building or still do work at the building, they don't talk about it, and that it is kind of a secret that many people kind of take what they see, they have these sightings, they get really freaked out, and then they just don't really talk about it, and they don't elaborate on it. Now, they did not elaborate on why that might be the case when I asked. However, I can imagine that having an event that you cannot fully explain like that could be stressful or traumatizing, and could be something that you would possibly suppress, or even, perhaps if you brought it up to your supervisors, there'd be very little that could be done in remedying a situation such as these. In addition to this, I don't know, you think about these big hotel companies and just big companies in general that, could something like a ghost story or stories that your employees see something they could not explain, could that potentially affect business? Could there be an underlying root cause that says, okay, if you see something that you can't fully explain, don't talk about it, because A, there's really nothing we can do about it, and B, you're going to get some type of kickback from upper management when it comes to these ghost stories, because maybe they could affect business in some type of way. Again, that is merely me making a sort of far-fetched accusation, but that's just my 2 cents. Now, of course, we live in a day and age that is very much focused on profit and how much we can get out of a certain dollar. So it would not surprise me that there is an underlying belief like that there, like I said, there's really not much you can do when a worker has an experience, a paranormal experience that they cannot explain, or when they try to bring that up to potentially a supervisor or upper management, that is pretty much shot down and say, hey, we don't talk about those type of things because it could affect business. Again, that's kind of me taking an educated guess as to why maybe employees don't talk about it, and why they kind of didn't really elaborate on why them and their coworkers and everybody that they had interacted with didn't really talk about these things, and that it was a not so well kept secret, but well kept secret, that people just kind of didn't really talk about these things. And I find that very fascinating, but also equally intriguing, because I didn't get a solid answer on that. But with that all being said, I think this is a perfect opportunity to move into our theories section. And to be honest with you, I think this is going to be a very short theories section, because if you ask me, I don't even really buy into the idea that there could be multiple theories here. If any of you are longtime listeners to the show and have listened to episodes where I cover the paranormal, I am very much a believer in the paranormal, and I think that there is personally too much evidence to support the existence of it. In addition to this, I live very close to the hotel, and the stories about it being haunted have existed since I was a very young kid, and have existed in the minds of locals for decades. I personally believe that the hotel is haunted by spirits and ghosts of some sort, the ghost of Princess Carolyn Stickney being pretty much a confirmed idea. However, I am more or less intrigued about the possibility of other spirits living within the hotel, or maybe the possibility of there being a dangerous ghost that coexists there. I find that curious and equally fascinating, but with the amount of history that is at the property and the amount of death that has occurred here, it checks all the boxes of locations that have some sort of paranormal attachment. And for all these reasons, coupled with the sightings, I think there is without a doubt ghosts at the Mount Washington. Again, I could go down a separate theory and I say, okay, maybe these ghost stories are made up for tourism. I don't even fully believe that. Like I said, I grew up, not very far from here. And like I said, the stories have existed for decades that the hotel was haunted. In fact, there is a lot of hotels in the northern New Hampshire area, and even in New England as a whole, that have said to be haunted just because of how long they've been in existence and things like that. These super historic places that have just had a history of death and things like that, and you cannot help but think that any sort of spiritual attachment would not be taking place at these locations that are basically a century plus years old. So with that being said, I think without a doubt the Mount Washington Hotel is haunted. I myself, having a not a sighting but a personal experience on that tour, kind of opened my eyes a little bit more to the possibility of the property being haunted itself. And then obviously having interviewed the friend of mine and getting their perspective on things and the few sightings that they had as well. When they were talking to me about this, the story in which they heard the man's voice coming with inside the bathroom, that was probably the most telling story that they had when it came to the property and hauntings and things like that. And that was the significant event that occurred for them that they could not explain. They could not figure it out. It had truly stumped them, and there was nothing that they could do to explain it other than labeling it under the category of, okay, that was something paranormal that happened, and we have no idea how to fully explain that. Again, with that being said, I think you have so many sightings, so many testimonials, and while I did struggle to find some sightings, I kind of expected there to be kind of like a treasure trove of some. There could be so many sightings out there that people are just so afraid to share, maybe for the fear of ridicule or maybe for the fear of, retaliation of some regard. You have all that factoring into it as well. But with that being said, that's my personal opinion. I absolutely think there's ghosts here, and I think this episode was a good little dip of our toes back into the paranormal while we are now in October in the heart of spooky season. So with that being said, I appreciate you all turning into this week's episode of The Haunting of the Mount Washington Hotel. I hope you all enjoyed it, going back into a paranormal topic for this week, and I will see you all on the next one.